again, the point of this presentation is to raise our awareness about what mold is and what exactly we're dealing with, and why it's so important to have every mold-looking like substance tested beforehand to determine if it is mold or if it's something else. You guys with me? All right, here we go. All right, so mold belongs to the kingdom of fungi, or it's probably pronounced fungi. As a matter of fact, it's one of those common mispronunciations. And there are about 200 species of fungi that we commonly encounter in our homes, workplaces. The most common are yeast and mold. Mold is a very complex form of fungi. They produce microscopic spores that germinate in the presence of water. Now, I guess the best way to describe what mold would kind of look like on a cellular level would be picture this as being the soil from, like soil, and then you have a tree growing up. Can I borrow your pen? Perfect. All right, so you have a tree growing up. Now, what would be underneath that soil typically? Root, right? So the roots are all underneath. Now, the thing is with mold is that at the very surface of it is what we would see on walls. Now, underneath all that, all the roots, that's where all the good stuff is hiding. So that's why if you guys, kill mold with bleach, for example, it removes it from the surface. Then you'll notice after about a month or so, or a couple of weeks, the mold grows back again. That's because of its, all that good stuff being underneath and the roots being embedded. Now, when mold grows up to the surface, it looks like a tree. It pretty much looks like a branch with, kind of a big leafy type of top. Now, those leaves at the very top, they scatter, almost like the leaves on a tree during fall. As soon as the wind comes, all the leaves kind of go all over the place. What goes all over the place is what's called spores. Now, those spores are microscopic. And those spores are what cause, infections, respiratory issues, all that kind of stuff. The very neat thing about spores, or neat in one way, is that when they kind of get traveled off, and usually, by air, by someone walking by it, the spores themselves will go to another room, they will land on something, and as soon as moisture or water comes into contact with, it automatically starts to germinate and reproduce. Right, so when you think of it that way, it's kind of really scary, right? That we got mold spores that could float around and germinate upon contact with water. And especially when you think about in terms of the human body, where we're made up of about 70% of water. So if we're inhaling mold spores in the air, and that comes into contact with our lungs, which is fluid-based, what do you think happens with those spores inside of our body? They begin that process of germination, which result in all these issues that you hear about with health issues when it comes to mold. Which is again why having something like the Hydro HEPA filter system is important to have in a house, because it captures all those mold spores.
Does that thing do humidifier too?
I don't think
it's a silly question.
Does it? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. That is a good question. I was wondering about that myself and just failed to ask it. But
is there anything that mold won't grow on?
Not necessarily, actually. Well, what we'll learn about, and again, I've asked everyone to keep their questions at the very end, because a lot of things throughout the presentation will answer. But mold, all it takes is an organic compound to kind of grow itself on. Now, during our last presentation, we had a group of home inspectors who were asking, well, okay, explain this to me, mold buster guy. If I go into a kitchen and I see mold growing on the plastic on the window, that's not an organic compound. How do you explain that? And our response was, well, how do you know it was mold 100%? How do you not know it was something else? And at that point, he just kind of stood there and didn't really know what to say. So again, to keep in mind that based on science, that mold or fungi can only grow on an organic compound, such as wood, drywall, cloth, all that kind of stuff. Now, there are three major conditions that are necessary for mold to grow. The first is food source, so that's where we're talking about that organic compound, such as wood, drywall, fabrics. It could also be food, like we find mold in bread and other things like that. Temperature. All right, so temperature is another interesting thing. So if the temperature is of high humidity, do you guys think that mold will grow?
Yes.
Right? If it's low humidity, what do you guys think?
No.
Less. Exactly. So the thing is, again, with mold spores, I spent some time talking about it, was that they're very small. They're invisible to the naked eye. They're microscopic. They're very light. They can disperse through the air, so it could take something as subtle as a dog walking through a moldy area to disperse the spores and getting to float around. Spores can become airborne. They can survive severe conditions, the spores themselves, because of their thick outer wall. Actually, one of the kind of cellular constructs of a mold spore is the same construct that's found over a lobster, right? So you know that hard shell? That same cell structure is found on a mold spore, which is kind of messed up when you think about it, right? That mold spores look like little lobsters floating around the air. So water allows mold spores to germinate, and they produce toxins. So mold, depending on what kind of mold, and we're going to look at the major different kinds of mold, can produce some pretty toxic consequences. So in a 1 square foot of mold, you could find over 1 billion mold spores. Now, picture if you guys have walked into a house. Has anyone here walked into a house and like the entire wall was covered in what looked like to be mold, right? Horrible, right?
Awesome.
Awesome.
Smells great.
Just smells great. Yeah. Fear level spikes through the roof, right? Like you immediately cover your hand. So I mean, like in just 1 square foot, you can really, there's a lot of problems, which is why it's important to remove it right away. All right. So where to look for? Where do you guys think? So naturally, behind walls or under carpets, and also bathrooms, exactly. Now, why do you guys think that behind walls or in between walls it's so important? No airflow, yeah, condensation. All right, now what else is in walls that we know about?
Cellulose.
Wood. Now, do we keep the pipes behind walls?
Yeah.
Right, so what do you think happens? We talked about condensation, right? Condensation from pipes. What if a pipe happens to just have a little bit of leak? What happens is you have a continual drip of water. And where there's water, and poor circulation, poor ventilation, you have like a prime breeding ground for mold. Now, why is mold a problem? 2 main reasons. Structural damage, obviously, right? So with structural damage, it's costly. It's it's time consuming. The people have to go in and rebuild, repair, do all that kind of stuff. So mold is a problem in that way, and major health problems, from mild allergies to serious respiratory conditions. Big thing right now in the news is about homeowners who are purchasing a home that was previously a grow-op and running into some major problems. And the reason with that is because mold in grow-ops is prime breeding pool for mold. And what do you guys think that is? What's with the grow-op? High humidity, humid, right? Lots of it, right? Now, well, what if the marijuana plants were grown hydroponically? Even worse, right? It's all water, right? And the thing is, with those types of those homemade setups, is that they're filled with faults and problems. So it's water leaking all over the place, and not to mention the people who are maintaining the home aren't necessarily 100% on the ball. So so it makes it difficult. So when you're running into a home, and if you guys are selling a home that was previously a grow-op, I mean, the need to kind of get mold busters in and research that kind of stuff and check to make sure that everything's okay is really important. So we already talked about some of the causes of mold, but we'll go through them again. Repetition is always good for us. So leaks in pipes or in roofs, so any type of contact with water, cracks in walls or foundations. All right, so mold can grow in foundations, like cement, concrete, that kind of stuff. Flooding or other forms of water intrusion. So springtime is time where all the snow starts melting away. Water in the river rises, and you get a lot of flooding. You get a lot more water kind of intrusion in our homes. It's good to make sure that we dry them out properly. Inadequate ventilation. Again, like we were talking about earlier with the particle counter, it's important to have great ventilation in your room in order to make sure that your particle count gets lower. And especially if you're in a house where there's mold and there's mold spores floating around, what you really want is you want to make sure that the air quality gets closer to zero. If, for example, if there was a window in this room right now and we were to crack open the window, the particle count would go down. It wouldn't go down to the point where it was zero, but it would still go down drastically. So it's important to have proper ventilation in our homes. Also, if there's poor insulation in people's homes, you're going to run into some problems there. Just like we were talking about earlier about between the walls, how that becomes one of the primary spots for mold to grow because of, there's lack of light. Mold is a fungi, so it grows in darkness. There's lack of ventilation. There's condensation, and if the insulation is poor, then you're just allowing other elements to come in that would help breed mold spores. Moisture is the mold's biggest kind of ally. So there are several ways to prevent mold growth. One of them is to make sure that there's good moisture control. Make sure that you reduce the relative humidity. You eliminate and repair sources of excess moisture. So it's good to always regularly go over bathrooms, especially check the bathtubs, toilets, all that kind of stuff. Look out for leaky gaskets and all the rest of that stuff, and make sure that it's properly dried out.
Would you suggest like an air exchanger if the building doesn't have one? I see one that's good air circulation, one of the plates there.
Yep, that'd be good for sure. And we certainly recommend like the HEPA filters, and the reason, and we'll get to the HEPA filter in a second, is because it's able to actually catch the mold spore itself. A lot of filtration systems, or like fans or other things like that, won't be able to capture bacteria on a microscopic level. So although your circulation might be good, you might just be circulating mold spores around the room, and we know if they come into contact with water, they start to multiply. So not cool. Cleanliness, again, that's just a general thing. If things are dirty and clean, that you're leaving it open for bacteria growth. So there are different types of mold, like we talked about. There's 4 primary types of mold, and they're all based on their different types of kind of exposure to water. And as you'll notice, there's actually mold that grows in the desert. So it requires some water, but not a lot. This is the most common kind. It's a hydrophilic mold. It requires a lot of water. It's usually found indoors after a significant water intrusion, like in, we're talking about bathrooms or after floods. Its most well-known species is the one that we've probably all seen at one point in our life, which is Stachybotrys, which is the black mold. It's the disgusting-looking one. So this little guy, don't be fooled by his cuteness, okay, is what would look like black mold spores. Right, so this is what we were talking about on that microscopic level, where this is the top part of the mold, and then on top of all these is like millions of little leaves, which are called spores, and that what kind of goes off into the air and germinates, and the rest of it's down here. So I'll pass this guy around, and you guys could get acquainted with the black mold.
It's been in this room too long.
Now the thing is with black mold is that it's extremely toxigenic. So that's.
Does it have a name?
You give him a name.
Damien.
Moldy? Okay. Moldy.
Damien the devil.
Now the thing is with black mold is where you'll find the most toxigenic problems. It's the kind of mold that will cause the most health problems. It's the most common type of mold that you'll find causing respiratory issues and so on and so forth. The other kind is the Mesoseal mold. It requires a little bit less moisture and grows in average conditions, like little water damage, basic stuff. Its common species are 2 different kinds of mold, and this kind doesn't really produce anything toxic. It doesn't really produce anything dramatic, but it's still detrimental. Especially if you look at it from a point of view, if you have a child around, right? And what do kids like to do most, right? Put things in their mouth, right? Touch things and put things in their mouth. And if you're coming into contact with something that has mold, and you're putting it, and the child is putting it into their mouth, what do you think that's doing to a child's immune system? Right? There's tons of various possibilities for that, and just the thought of it is kind of scary itself. Which is why when you detect anything that may be mold-like, you got to call the mold busters to come and make sure that it is what it is and that they properly remove it. The other types of mold is zero tolerant and xerophilic. So zero tolerant grows in drier conditions with little humidity or moisture. Some of the species is the Aspergillus, this little guy over here. Now, as you can tell, it's the same type of kind of pattern that we were looking at with the black mold, where this is the trunk, and then these are the branches at the very top. And if you can tell, like they both have very different kind of ways that they're set up. And actually, that just shows you the complexity of the different types of mold.
Can we call that one Brad?
Okay. So we
Rod
got
the
moldy
bees.
and threat.